and welcome to the Fellowship of the Ring's 20th anniversary special. My name is Nikki. I'm also known as Miss Bangin, and I am joined here today by my fellow Council of Fan member, Fen. How are you today?
Hey, yeah, fine. Terribly
Fine?
a bit cold, but fine.
Very good. Now, as you guys probably already know, on the 19th of December 2001, The Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring was released. So today, to celebrate that, we are talking with Ian Nathan, who is the author of Peter Jackson, Anything You Can Imagine, The Making of Middle-earth, which is basically a book detailing the development of The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit film trilogies. Now, Ian, you are known for making both filmmaking guides and biographies, and you've written books on Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, Tim Burton, the Fantastic Beasts, and the Terminator series, amongst other things. But
It's a
most exciting
broad
one,
spectrum.
very, very. But of course, the most exciting one for us today is
Yeah.
the book about the Lord of the Rings. So
Absolutely.
tell us, Ian,
Yeah.
how did you end up doing what you do?
How did I do it? Well, it's a long story. It goes right back to my student days when I was studying biology, environmental biology of all things. And I wasn't very good at experiments, any of those. I'll try and do this, the kind of pre-seed version. And I always loved movies. Movies have been an obsession since I was a child, when they were kind of the great outings you went on. And I was a bit obsessed throughout my life. And I was advised to go for scientific publishing. And my careers person at the university said, well, go and join the student newspaper. And the day I joined the student newspaper, I walked on the corridor to where they had their offices. The door slammed in front of me and someone sort of rushed out and rushed past me and stormed off into the distance. And I was a bit like, well, this sounds a bit crazy. And I walked in and the editor was like, oh, yeah. And I sort of explained who I was. He said, well, can you look after the entertainment's desk? Because I've just fired the entertainment's editor. There was some kind of romantic conflict going on between them. It wasn't the best run student newspaper. But basically I did film, music, books. I kind of farmed out music because I didn't know huge amounts enough to write about it. I wasn't confident enough. But films, I just basically ring-fenced and owned as my own. And that was my career decision made, whether I knew it or not at the time. And obviously It's a long journey to becoming a film journalist and struggling as a freelancer and getting incrementally nearer to the goal until finally I joined a magazine called Empire. That's there's a bit of an interruption there, but that's a very big film magazine based out of the UK. I got on the staff and I worked my way up to editor there. And I spent 20 years at Empire, in which when my Lord of the Rings journey begins, because I covered it for Empire. And Peter was a big fan. Peter Jackson was a big fan of the magazine. We were the first magazine to put it on the cover. And right back very early on, we had a kind of faith in it. I mean, this was one of the biggest fantasy books ever written, if not the biggest fantasy book ever written. We kind of stuck our finger in the air and thought this could be a hit. But this was the time when Hollywood was kind of laughing at New Line and laughing at Peter Jackson, going, this is Heaven's Gate. This is the biggest, craziest production ever put on. It's going to be a grand failure. And they were quite depressed, I think, out in New Zealand. I think they were struggling with the media they were getting. And Peter Jackson tells the story that there was a day when it arrived on set, the copy of Empire with it on the cover. It was a Frodo shot. And they were shooting Cirith They were shooting that sequence. So it was Sean Astin and Elijah Wood on set. And Peter sort of said, look, everybody, we do matter. They said, this is going to be all right. And he said it was just the first time something positive had happened around the films. Obviously, there'd been online stuff. Harry Knowles had been very supportive, and The One Ring was sort of kicking in at that point, and they were being very supportive. But it was still early days, even in terms of internet coverage. And that was the moment. And Peter's a very loyal guy. If you're on side, he sticks by you. It's a kind of a New Zealand trait. And he loved Empire through that. And I got to know him very well because I visited the set and all those kind of elements and adventure. And he stuck by me. And again, to cut the long story short, when I left Empire and wanted to write film books and sort of moved into that direction as the things you've talked about, I knew I had all this material already accumulated in Lord of the Rings, vastly more than I could ever put in the magazine. And I went to Peter and I said, look, if you don't want me to do this, I won't do it. But I want to write a book about the making of. I want to sort of take what you've done in the DVD, which are incredible and so detailed, but do it as a kind of written version and drill down even more into the detail, if that was possible, to make it even more incrementally studied, not in an academic way, but just to tell it in the minutiae. So, for instance, the great legend of the casting of Viggo Mortensen, it's talked about on the DVDs, and everyone knows the story. He came in at the 11th hour, and Stuart Townsend hadn't worked out, and it was all a nightmare. They didn't know they were going to get him. But instead of ignoring that story, because I thought everybody knew it, I went down into the detail even more, and I worked out how many phone calls there were, and what was going on at New Line, and how the deal was struck, and what was the very first scene. And I sort of scraped away the kind of mythology a little bit and peered into the production. And of course, it's even more exciting once you kind of get beyond the legend. There's kind of fantastic things going on. I mean, it's in the book, but there's a great thing from Peter when he said there's been a series of phone calls, and Fran Walsh had taken one, Philip Boyens had taken one. And finally, Viggo Mortensen's a very strange fellow. I don't know if you guys know him at all, or met him, but he's very quietly spoken. He's kind of away with it. He's kind of in a distant place in his mind quite a lot of the time. And he was out in Iowa or somewhere on this kind of terrible line. And he said, I've got to speak to Peter. Peter Jackson was kind of pulled off set. In fact, they were shooting The Prancing Pony at the time. He said, with an empty table where Strider was meant to be sat. And he got on the phone, and there was Viggo. And Viggo just doesn't say anything. Peter's going, well, he's trying to explain and sell him the film and sell him the role. It's the most important part. And he's this guy who's kind of becomes a king and goes on this journey. Big talk from Peter, really trying to sell it to the guy. And Viggo just says nothing. Because he said he didn't know Viggo at that time. He didn't know that's just what Viggo's like. He's processing. What he was doing was just thinking through what Peter was saying. And Peter Jackson just said, he thought, well, I've lost him. I've got to go back out and look for another Aragorn. We've got to try and find it. And he was crestfallen. So right at the end, Viggo just says, well, I'll see you on Tuesday, basically. The vitamin bloke. So it's like, oh, okay then. And that's, they got him. And so what was kind of this kind of big, glorious story about the miracle of Viggo Mortensen. Once you get into it, it's quite a strange story about personalities. And that's what I tried to do with the book, to get into the people as much as the story, and to see it from different points of view. And it's a biography of Peter in a way, and it's a biography of the film, and it's a biography of many people who go along on the journey as well, including Viggo.
Yes.
That's brilliant. I like how you can sort of, because there isn't, no matter how much B-roll you have, no matter how many behind the scenes cameras you have, there is always moments that you're not going to be able to capture. And then you can go ahead and write it in as much detail as you have done in your book is just brilliant. I'm looking forward to reading it myself. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it.
that was a perfect example, because I had it on my mind. Because we have spoken before on this, and last time I think the book mostly came up as a series of very interesting anecdotes like this one, but I think in many ways presenting it as a series of anecdotes does it a big disservice, because the point of it really, much more than an individual story, is what you just said, which is stripping away the mythology from the making of the movies and making it much more, kind of a rigorous study in a way, without, as you said, without it being academic, which I don't think it is, but
that's the attention. I mean, there's a great history in film book publishing of the story of the disaster. There's a book called Final Cut about the making of Heaven's Gates. There's a book called The Devil's Candy about Bonfire of the Vanities. And they're fantastic books, but they're all about disasters. And in some ways, it's much easier to write the story of a disaster because it's full of drama, people getting fired and everything going wrong. But this was a story of a glorious success. So that I had to get my head around. Is that what's your arc? And of course, there's a lot of drama at the beginning with getting it made, dealing with Miramax, moving on to New Line, the miracle of the green light, and all those things, and the battle to get to production. That is a dramatic story that I kind of really pulled apart.
And the bad press as well.
The bad press that was following them, and they were getting laughed at, and right through to, I mean, almost, it's an incredible story in terms of the sort of temperature in the outside world in Hollywood. And, you guys are probably far too young to remember it in any detail, but at the time, it really was being mocked as a sort of a film project until Cannes. And New Line, get a lot of criticism in some ways, New Line, and they're sort of inhibiting Peter in some ways, but actually they did a lot of really good things, apart from greenlighting the films. And the Cannes decision was a New Line one, and it was a really brave decision to show 25 minutes at Cannes, as they said, to change the conversation about the film, because it'd been so negative and it was seen as a Heaven's Gate like thing. And suddenly they said, look, you're going to show people how good this footage is. And they showed the cave troll sequence and a lot of montages around. In fact, that is almost my, epiphany, in terms of seeing it, because, I'd already invested in it in terms of the magazine, and I committed the magazine to this path. And I went down to Cannes. I was going to interview Peter and do all the things there. But it was seeing the 25 minutes. That was the crucial element. And it's in the book. But it was like we were all waiting outside. There was about 20 journalists, and we were like children, sort of pressed up against the door, desperate to get in. Already, we were kind of getting a sense of something really exciting going on. But it's sitting down, we had no idea. Peter introduced it and talked a little bit about grading, not being finished, and and special effects still being tinkered with. So we must bear that in mind. And then the first shot is in the I think you can see it now as part of the new box set, the actual Cannes footage. Yeah. But the first shot is it's Gandalf arriving at the door of Bag End and Bilbo coming out. So it was the first time we saw the scale differences. And for about a minute, your brain sort of goes a bit haywire. You're thrown straight into that. And you're like, well, it looks perfect, but something uncanny is going on. Because I know that Ian Holm is not that small, and I know that Ian McKellen is not that tall. But this... But I think what's incredible, and it's true of the finished films, is after that minute was over in your brain, you just got the characters took over and you just started going into it. And then the footage played, and it sort of culminated with it's the whole Moria sequence, the battle with the cave troll. And then it wasn't a completed battle. There are differences, but then it's the Balrog. The Balrog just sort of leans down and there's that kind of fiery roar. And we're all kind of so into it that when it stopped, we're all just kind of like, oh, we were so captured by these 25 minutes. And that was the point. And nobody else talked about anything that night. There was about 30 journalists, I think, who saw it. But if you were in any bar in Cannes that night, you would swear everyone had seen it. And they were all going, this is good as Star Wars. This is going to change Hollywood. Absolutely. In one day, the temperature completely changed on that film. And that was New Line. And that was their decision. And then Mark Ordesky, who's a great voice in the book, the executive producer, who was basically the guy who ran interference between studio and production. He said it was like that moment bought them the kind of freedom to go away and finish the films properly and finish the fellowship in a way they no longer felt under pressure. Obviously, there was time and money and all those kind of normal things, but after that happened, they were kind of liberated to complete fellowship, and they didn't do any more promotion until until Christmas, until the lead up to the release of fellowship. They said, right, let's kind of lock it all down again. There was, I think, the trailers, you might be able to correct me, sort of August, September, maybe that year. There was the next trailer came along, but they held back because they thought they'd done enough with Cannes, and they created this kind of anticipation. And now the trick, is to actually hide again and not show people stuff. And they kind of, and we were all going, what's it going to be like? We've seen 25 minutes. It was, but that was the point. My faith, was absolutely upheld. Mark Ordesky tells a great story that he was standing in the projector booth the first time they showed the footage, and they showed it to the cast first of all, and he was standing in the projector booth with some of the foreign distributors. And they played it, and he cried. He's a very emotional chap, but he cried because he could see the effect it was having. And they were all hugging him, these foreign distributors, because they'd all put a lot of money in, and they had a lot riding on it, quite small companies. And they just said, after 25 minutes, they were absolutely, fully convinced, rightly so, that it was going to be all right.
Of course, yeah. That's brilliant. I think it was sort of the first time, at least in my time, that they had attempted something as high fantasy as The Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
So they were rightfully concerned about, because there wasn't like really a big fantasy thing before The Lord of the Rings, I feel.
There was, I think, in the 80s a little bit, and then it died away.
Willow, Legend,
Excalibur, Legend, yes.
Yeah. Well, Excalibur is an interesting point, because Excalibur was born out of John Boorman's attempt to make Lord of the Rings. Yeah, he'd done a screenplay.
I read that, yeah.
Have you read that screenplay? I think you can find it online. You've got to read that screenplay, because it's the craziest thing. It's absolutely mad. It's quite
It is.
erotic. It's not very Tolkien.
Well,
It kind of
yeah.
changed quite a lot, but it's
Mm.
worth reading if you can find it.
Yes,
Did
yes,
you
it's
have any-
available. People can read it. It's very, I want to say humorous, but it's
Yeah, it's
peculiar.
quite surreal and
Like
he sort of takes them.
Excalibur, really.
Yeah, a lot of what's in Excalibur came out of his experiences of writing.
Yeah.
And to be fair to him, he got a lot of the story down into a 3-hour movie. The screenplay was going to be one film.
Yeah.
And it's different, but it's there's some really crazy things.
Yeah.
Dancing and there's I recommend everyone to track it down if you can on the internet.
Yeah, it's
and
very,
have a read, just as a kind of just a thought experiment, as it were.
But Nikki does bring a good point. There had been fantasy films. What there had been in the 90s were kind of historical spectacle movies, and that was really the thing that I saw when I saw Fellowship of the Ring. I saw basically a kind of fantasy Braveheart, really. And I know I've read a lot of interviews of Jackson's where that's where he stresses it over and over again, that's what he's making. So that's what I saw. The earnestness of it was very apparent, I guess is my point.
What I found, the reason I think I fell in love with, because I was one of those people who saw the Fellowship of the Ring before I read the movie, before I read the book.
Me as well.
But because I saw it, I went on and read the Fellowship, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King in a week because I was obsessed. And now, like, my entire shelf is filled with books from Tolkien. I've read pretty much everything I can find. I'm super fan. But what I found attractive with the movie was that, yes, it was high fantasy. Yes, there were all these creatures that don't exist in the real world, but it was still, to some extent, it was still relatable. It wasn't as magical as the fantasy films from the 80s. It wasn't like so far-fetched that you couldn't put yourself in that situation no matter what.
Yes.
And that's what I really loved about them, because I was like, well, there's an elf and it's the most natural thing in the world, you know? It feels like they could potentially exist in the real world. And I really enjoyed that.
Peter talks a lot about that, about the major hurdle to overcome is believability.
Yeah.
And you were always 10, 20 degrees off being absurd. If you listen to the dialogue, if you, as you say, elves with pointy ears, if you start to boil it down, it's like, oh, this can be laughable. He remembered the French and Saunders. I don't know if you know French and Saunders. They're a sort of pair of comedians in Britain. They always do these movie parodies. They did a movie parody of Fellowship.
Oh,
and he said that, he said, we were 20 degrees off that. Yeah. And he said, the believability was the primary thing. Absolutely what you said. It's, do Middle Earth as a real place. It's a historical drama. It's not a fantasy. These are just the people who live here. These are the events. Magic, actually, even Tolkien did this. Magic is quite minimal in the story, because Tolkien always felt it was a risky thing. Gandalf could be too convenient. But one of the reasons Gandalf keeps disappearing from the stories is he's too powerful. So he helps out too much. So Tolkien sort of whisked him away on other errands and sort of mock deaths and things to keep the magic out of the story, because magic just helps you out too much. Have you seen the new Spider-Man films, to go for a slight tangent?
No,
okay.
Not yet.
Well, anyway, they've got Doctor Strange in it. I'm sure you know that. This isn't a spoiler.
Yeah.
But I think, to my mind, Doctor Strange is too convenient a character because he does magic. So it's like you reach a point in the script where it just says Doctor Strange does a spell and this happens. And you don't have to do any work narratively to make A to get to B, because Doctor Strange just does a spell. But actually in Lord of the Rings, they have to do a lot of work. There's no magical conveniences in it. There's a little bit that the wizards fighting. There's, I think, Gandalf riding out in Return of the King with the beam of light. But actually, Gandalf doesn't do much magic at all. He doesn't. Fireworks is probably his biggest thing. So it is a realist story in that sense. Yes, there are monsters. Yes, there are exotic places. And of course, there's this kind of fundamental idea of a ring being imbued with the life force of an evil overlord. And exactly how does that work and what is it? Well, you don't really need to think about it too hard. But beyond that, believability was fundamental. And I think that comes down, a lot of it, not just New Zealand and the quality of Weta and obviously Peter and the work in the screenplay, but the actors they chose. Again, Philippa Boyens, talked a lot about Ian McKellen would walk on and just deliver these lines, and she said you would just feel warm. You thought, yes, that makes it. You just hear Gandalf talking, and it felt normal and it felt right. And then Christopher Lee would come in, and he said, "There's Saruman. We don't need to explain Saruman. You just have to have Christopher Lee talk, and the whole audience gets Saruman straight away." That's just great casting.
It is very, very. I can't picture anyone else. I mean, I didn't have the reading of the book, so I didn't have an image in my head before I saw it, but I felt like it was like when I was reading, it made sense afterwards because the casting was so well done and well
Can I ask,
suited.
Nicoline, what was the experience like of reading the extended version, as it were, in Tolkien? And obviously there are a lot of differences. The structure is there, but there's no Old Forest, and there's no Fog in the Barrow-Downs, and there's no Tom Bombadil, all those kind of things. Was it quite a strange experience at first? Because you'd be picturing the film in your head, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's like that with everything. You either read the book first or you see the movie first, and you always kind of expect not everything in the book to be in the movie because it's not really possible or doable or necessary always when you do the visual storytelling. I only saw the first one before, like the Fellowship, before I read the whole thing. But it was interesting, these little sections that they had skipped, like the part with Tom Bombadil, where I was like, wait, this doesn't feel like I have not seen this. I don't know this part. But then you kind of get into it and you're just like, this is really fascinating. And then you start wondering, well, why wasn't that part used? And again, that goes probably back to what you were saying about the magic as well. Tom Bombadil would also be too powerful to have there, and it wouldn't make any sense. So it was a good, pleasant experience for me.
So the Council of Elrond in the book is huge, isn't it? It just goes on forever.
Yeah.
That's kind of this vast amounts of information and subplots and storylines that are all thrown in. They did an amazing job at sort of getting that under control in the film. And that was the hardest thing in screenplay terms. Again, it's a Philippa Boyne. She just said Rivendell and Council of Elrond killed us. And she just said, whatever they were doing, she just got this mantra, as long as we don't go back to Rivendell, it's fine. Never take me back to Rivendell. Because it was so hard to write, because you've got to introduce the Fellowship, basically, a lot of new characters all in one go. You've got to introduce new species. You've got to introduce dwarves. Really, you've got to make sense of elves at that point. You've got to introduce Boromir and the whole of the idea of mankind. You've got to do all that in one sequence. And of course, eye lines are a nightmare because they're all different heights. And of course, this was kind of the beginning of before The Hobbit. So it was partly shot outdoors. A lot of the set was actually outdoors, and the wind would blow in and drive them mad.
Oh no!
Council of Elrond was very tough to get through, I think, for everyone concerned. But it's a masterful bit of adaptation, if you want. To turn it,
for sure.
Yeah. What I did find, like, I was glad, to be honest. There are a lot of poems, a lot of really long poems and songs and things. I would skim through them sort of because I was like, this is not relevant to my story. I want to keep reading what's going on. So I'm kind of glad that they chose to not like have people burst out in songs, and like the little ones that they have chosen to add in, especially in the extended versions, are great. But if they were to keep all of them, this would have been a musical, or like it would feel like it would add so much to the films, like in lengthwise. So I'm glad they didn't do that.
Goes back to the kind of playing it as history, I think, which was a very wise decision.
Yeah.
And certainly not something that I have seen in any other genre, quote unquote, movie before.
Yeah.
So
songs would have been. I mean, that's all Tolkien is, and Tolkien's history in verse and studying philology. That's all him. But the first problem any adapter of Lord of the Rings faces, and obviously many attempts until Peter kind of got it right, was the screenplay. And how do you take this 1,000-page book and get it down into even 3 films? It was trouble. And the 2-film version is quite interesting. That they were going to do the 2-film version with Miramax. There was no Lothlorien in that. There was no Denethor. There were things now you'd be like, oh my God, how could it not be? But that's the rational stage they were at with 2 films. Again, it's lovely Philippa's story. As soon as they heard they got 3 films, she said the first thing that went back in was Lost Lorien. She just went back in and shoved it in and started writing it. Just right now, that's going in because we can't not have it. And Galadriel was going to be at Rivendell. That was the plan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she would be at Rivendell, kind of like she's in The Hobbit, and that's where they would meet. It doesn't make any sense. But if you're doing 2 films, a lot has to go because you've got to get your story going.
From a screenplay point, it makes a lot of sense. Like if you were doing it as an original screenplay, you wouldn't have Lothlorien there. You wouldn't necessarily even have Rivendell there, but you certainly wouldn't have had Lothlorien.
Yeah, they break the rhythm, don't they?
You get the point. It's like Peter always said, what does he say? That like in movie logic, quote unquote, the Battle of Pelennor Fields has to be a defeat, and yet in the book it's a victory. So there's a lot of things that are very. It's a complicated book to adapt for sure. Yes.
Yeah, Tolkien doesn't help you. Tolkien does things that are very unmovie-like. I mean, he's fantastic at set pieces. Tolkien. Yeah, he would have been a very good screenwriter. You think of the Mines of Moria and astonishing set pieces he puts together. But in storytelling, sort of moral terms and momentum terms, you got to lose Pelennor Fields because he had to create another battle for them to still be jeopardy out in the world. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I'm really glad. It was also for me, because they were so long, they kind of changed the entire way that we make movies, I feel. Because I remember there was like an uproar. It's like, oh my God, did you hear the first Lord of the Rings movie is going to be like 3 hours long? 3 hours. No one had ever heard of something being 3 hours. And then it's like, it's 2 more films as well. Everybody was going like crazy about that. But I'm so glad they did that because you can see afterwards as well, like everything afterwards has become long form and more like they take their time to sort of really dig down and flesh out the story. And you can see it like most. I will say most because I don't know everyone, but most Lord of the Rings fans will only watch the extended versions. So they could have stuck with that as well. So it's
absolutely
it's cool.
That's another. There's a lot of pressure on the final cut of Fellowship, especially, and there's a lot of tension, as there always is between production company and director. At the sharp end, and there's a lot of fear, as you were saying, there's a lot of fear about it being over 3 hours and number of screenings you could do in cinemas and all those kind of sort of financial aspects. And the decision to do extended editions came as almost like a pressure release before Fellowship came out. They kind of said, well, let's put, it's Peter's idea, let's do a longer cut on DVD at some point once we get time and we can do all the added special effects. And that almost allowed them to finish the theatrical cuts because they could then relax and go, okay, we know that can be sacrificed. Like the gift giving sequence isn't in the theatrical cut. That can be sacrificed and put into the extended edition, and that can then, they can almost like be relieved to get on with things. Otherwise, it will never be seen. And I think that helped them out. But I'm like you. I've not seen the theatrical cuts for a long time, not since I wrote the book. So I compared the 2 cuts back then, and I can't remember what was in and what wasn't in. There's lots of things and details that are probably just in the extended cut. And there are big things. I remember the gift giving sequence and bits and pieces. But and obviously Aragorn singing about Beren and Lúthien. That's in the extended cut only. Yes. And it starts differently, doesn't it? It starts with Bilbo writing the kind of history.
No, it has the prologue, but I think it's like a minute shorter. I think I know this actually. They also tried to. The theatrical cut is more PG-13. The extended cut is more pushing at the edges of the envelope towards the R rating. So there's some violence that's not in the theatrical as well. There's like Peter's horror director side coming up.
The gore. He wants the gore.
I would have liked it to be rated R just as much, but sure. The length of movies
nowadays, no.
The length of the movies is a very important point, I think, because I'm not very popular in that way, in that I like my movies long, actually, because I like the idea of the movie being an endeavor rather than just something that kind of breezes past you. And most of my favorite movies are, well, comfortably over 2.5 hours. Lord of the Rings being, of course, at the top of the list, but others as well. So yeah, sure. The idea of a long movie at the time, there had been some, mostly in the kind of vein of historical movies like Dances with Wolves was very long, Braveheart was long, Titanic, Gladiator the year prior, but sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Ian,
Yes.
before you started, like, because I've seen other interviews where you've talked about this, and you knew that you wanted to write about this almost as soon as you heard that they were making the film. But before you started writing it, and before you got to know Peter and you got involved in it as much as you did you have any concerns?
Well, like, yeah, I mean, like people who'd read the book and had the book in their heads, because it's a very visual story, and Tolkien wrote it. So a lot of, you've already kind of made the film in your head as you read it. You visualize, not just Hobbiton, you visualize Moria and Lothlorien and right through to, Gondor and Rohan. You visualized it all. So that's always a bit of a problem, that there's a film in your head that may not be in Peter's head, or that might be sort of different.
Yeah.
And so that was a concern for me. And I had very particular things that I felt was important to the story. So the first time I saw Fellowship, the theatrical cut, it wasn't the best version of my watching Rings experience, could be, because I was almost processing it in relation to the book. Elijah Wood talks about that. It's the first time it kind of rushes past you a bit, and you're just relieved it's there and it's okay. The second time, it just is extraordinary. Yeah. I mean, it's not that it's not extraordinary the first time, but there's a second time experience of watching Lord of the Rings that's just magical, because you just rest easy, you relax. Because obviously, the one thing was, as I said, I'd really invested a lot of my credibility in the magazine in those films. I'd say, we've got to put it on the cover. Publishers kind of lean on you and say, well, why are we doing this? And I mean, they hadn't read it, they're publishers. But so I was kind of concerned primarily that it was going to be as good as the canned footage, and it was going to live up to it. And then I had this thing, where there were bits that I thought should be in it, that the gift giving sequence, I felt that should have been in it, because I felt it was narratively important to kind of move it on. But I think they got around it. It's the light of Elendil, the kind of the thing that happens much later with Shelley. Yeah, they kind of have it in there in a kind of flashback sequence, don't they? But I thought it was. So that was an odd thing. And there are always things. No film is perfect. And in fact, I don't know if you want films to be perfect, because that's a kind of strangely inhuman thing to require of a piece of art. And everything's worth discussion. I would say, slight issues. And I've even talked to Peter Jackson about them. When I don't like Galadriel being angry. I don't like the special effects on that. I think you've got Cate Blanchett, just let her act. She's fantastic. Just let her do the stuff. I don't need a special effect at that point. But Peter just had this vision of her sort of turning into this sort of beam of light, kind of, it shows you the power of the elves. It just sort of sticks out a bit for me as something that doesn't work as well as it could. In fact, there was a lot of debate about that. I think New Line said the same things I said, just let Kate act the scene, just have her own it. We paid all this money for Cate Blanchett. Why spend even more money on special effects? And in fact, those effects, this is in the commentaries, I think, those effects weren't done by Weta. There are little bits and pieces because of time and pressure at Weta, where they had to farm them out to American companies. And I think it's the waters of the Ford sequence was done by Digital Domain, I think. Yes. And the Galadriel angry sequence was done outside of Weta. And it just doesn't quite sit with me. And it's only niggles, right? Because I mean, you get Peter going, and he doesn't watch the films again, and he will just pull them apart. He just hates things in them, like creatives. You just go, I can't bear
that. As
all
creatives do.
Yeah, I can't watch it because that didn't work. And you're like, what film are you watching? I've watched a different film to you. In fact, the only time he's watched them again, because he just doesn't watch his films again, was when Guillermo del Toro arrived to do The Hobbits, and they sat down in his cinema to watch all the three films again, to get into the world.
Yeah, and I watched an interview with him. He attested that they watched the extended cut.
The extended cuts on the big screen, which I've done. I've watched Fellowship extended cuts in Peter's cinema. I'll tell that story in a little bit. But apparently, in this Guillermo thing, it was Peter and Guillermo sitting at the front somewhere, and Philippa and Fran sitting a few rows back, laughing and giggling and pointing at things they thought were a joke in the film, because they just. Because it's almost like an exorcism in a way. You've been through this journey, and I think it becomes something you kind of have to laugh about because you've had this shared experience. And they were sent out. I think Peter turned around and got them out of the screening because they were making too much noise, like children. He said, no, we've got to watch this properly. Out you go. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, I saw when I was over there on one trip, this is in kind of supplementary shooting, and they showed the Fellowship extended cut before, obviously it was put on DVD, in the Camperdown Cinema. So I saw it on the big screen, first of all. And I saw it with cast members. So there's Bernard Hill and Viggo Mortensen sort of sat behind me, and there was they're all dotted about. But again, it's not as perfect as you think it is, because Bernard Hill and Viggo just talked the whole way through, laughing and giggling like children.
Sure.
And you just wanted to turn around and go, be quiet. I'm trying to watch this film.
Yeah,
you should have done this. I'm concentrating, because they were just sort of, the embarrassment, I think, of watching yourself on screen is a weird thing. I mean, you must know this from your acting. It must be quite a strange sort of out-of-body experience.
It's something you never really get used to, but at the same time, I like, as an actor, you're also well aware that if you want to be a good actor, you have to be prepared to watch yourself, and you have to be prepared to be your own critic, because you're looking at what you're doing and you remember what you thought at that moment, and you're just like, okay, that didn't work. Next time we try it differently. And I think also, as you're watching, you're remembering all these things that happened. So they would be talking about stuff like, oh, remember how we did that one take and then that was really awkward, or we couldn't stop laughing. You know, it just changes your entire experience of watching anything, really, when you're working in the same sort of, and you've experienced what it's like behind the magic, because it's a different kind of magic. It's the same kind of magic. I'm sure you know, Ian, because you were on set a few times. It's magic, but it's a different kind of magic. It's like
absolutely.
And,
the process, repeated takes and camera angles, endless lighting, all that kind of things to slow it down. But there was magic there. There was, I've done in my career, I've been privileged enough to do quite a lot of set visits, and there was something different about Lord of the Rings. There was something different about the atmosphere. They weren't relaxed, they weren't chilled, but they were different from Americans. They had this kind of Kiwi quality in which they wanted to share it with you. I mean, if you go on a set in America, it's like being on a school trip. You're surrounded by publicists, almost like ring fencing you, and they like stand here and don't talk to anyone until we tell you can. So everything's kind of paranoid a little bit. But as soon as we sort of touched down in New Zealand, in Wellington, it was just fun. And they were just coming, the first thing we did was they were shooting a sequence on the battlements of Helm's Deep. And it was a studio shot. It was Bernard Hill and Viggo sort of pre-battle, some kind of pickup. And Peter was just chatting to me and not paying any attention to the scene being shot. And he's like, it's fine. And he sort of turned around and goes, is that in focus? Okay, move on. He was, at that point, he was so confident. But that was the attitude around. They were clearly absolutely invested, absolutely devoted to it. But at the same time, they hadn't had much press, visiting them. They hadn't had that experience. And they just kept wanting to show you things. Come and see the miniatures. Come and see Weta Workshop. Come and do this. Come and meet the horses. And it's a bit kind of like, okay, slow down. I just need to take some stuff in. And they just, they had this extraordinary thing where they all ate. No one went and ate in their trailers or anything like that. They had this canteen. At the time, Stone Street Studios was quite primitive still. So it had a kind of corrugated iron roof. You could hear the rain banging on it. And they just had all the cast and all the kind of actors and all the kind of extras. Everyone was in eating dinner under this kind of, in this one room. And you'd look around, and there was kind of orcs in full makeup, sort of drinking out of cartons, because obviously they didn't have time to take the makeup off. And the only thing they could get through, they weren't allowed to eat. They could just drink kind of high calorie carton drinks. And then sort of Gandalf and Theoden would walk in, Ian McKellen and Bernard Hill, and their beards would be kind of wrapped in nets so they didn't get them in their dinner.
Yeah,
and of course, it was normal to them. But I didn't think I ate anything. I just sort of stared at this room. And then the third or fourth day we were there, they had a raffle, a kind of keep the cast and crew happy raffle. You know what raffles are, don't you? Names pulled out of a hat and prizes given. I mean, like a children's show, like a children's party.
Oh,
and they had this raffle. Bernard Hill was pulling the names out of the hat. And honestly, it was winning like Lord of the Rings caps and Lord of the Rings kind of sets. Last thing you think they would want, having worked on the films. And it was just
No,
like
that's
children.
brilliant.
Yeah.
I
They
would
kind of
just
name
be,
again.
oh my gosh, that sounds like so much fun. And was
Yeah.
that like for everyone? Like cast, crew, extras,
Yeah.
everyone was just a part of it?
Yes. I mean, it was obviously, I think there was sittings because it wasn't the biggest canteen in the world, and I think they obviously you couldn't have all the cast and crew in at one point, and there was so much being shot. I think there was kind of units that carried on for 1 hour and then stopped and they came in. I mean, it was a giant production in every sense of it. Just was this kind of giant machine turning over, but it just had this quaintness and everything. I mean, this is why I think the book was born in my head really at that point, because there were so many wonderful details. You would stand outside waiting to do whatever we're going to do next, where we're going to visit next. And the guys, sort of all the Hobbit extras, would wander up to you because they wanted to meet a journalist. This is exciting. And chat to you about who they played. Well, I've been Sam double, I've been a Frodo double. I'm playing hobbits at a wedding. They weren't meant to tell us about the wedding sequence. That was top secret. They were filming the wedding sequence of Sam and Rosie at one stage.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then you would say, well, who are you? And they would go, well, I'm a tax collector in my normal job. I've just joined the production.
Yeah, they
got
created so many jobs, like so many people joined that production.
But that was, that nuance and that sort of personality just told you something different was going on, this kind of elevated form of filmmaking.
Yeah, in relation to like the production of the TV series and also other productions in New Zealand, you have heard stories about the sort of New Zealand sort of hospitality and how New Zealand crew is different in the way that they are more easygoing, relaxed, friendlier. It's not like super strict, and that sounds like exactly like I imagined it, pretty much.
I'm just brilliant. I mean, the experiences. I think the second scene I saw being filmed was Brad Dourif and Christopher Lee, Saruman and Wormtongue. And it's the thing with well, not the dynamite, the explosive. And he sort of stops him from bringing the brand too close. And Brad Dourif is he's just a bit of a nutcase. He's a wonderful guy and a wonderful actor, but he's quite intense. So he was sort of in character. And then Peter just handed him some new lines to say in the scene. They'd rewritten it. And they were in biro on a piece of paper pulled out of a notebook. That's how professional it all was. And Brad Dourif's just like, you've come to see me fail, haven't you? I'm going to fail. He was so in character. But it was wonderful. It was just, there was Wormtongue and Saruman having this kind of sequence. And I can sort of pinpoint the ones I saw. But yeah, it was magical in that sense. Yeah, not the same as watching a finished film, but you could, I mean, it was that sense of the sets were so three-dimensional and so well put together. You just looked into Orthanc and it just came alive in front of you. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. Like it's like you said, like the magic, it's not the same kind of magic for people just watching the films and wanting to get into that world. That's all you need really, because the films are fantastic. But if you're even remotely interested in filmmaking, you should definitely read the book and also watch the behind the scene material, because it really does explain how filmmaking is. And I also find that with the Lord of the Rings extended versions and the extra material on it, that was also one of the first times I had ever seen that detailed amounts of info about how it was made. And it was the same with The Hobbit as well. It was just I I didn't put it down for days. I just kept watching everything that because it was just fascinating to see what goes on behind the camera as well. You don't really think about everyone that goes into creating something like that, like how important each person is behind the camera, how many people you need to sort of set up the lights, the sounds, different units shooting at the same time to get different scenes. It's not something that you think about unless you get to see it or hear about it. So I think
the
it's
desire,
brilliant.
and the desire to share it with the audience is it's very endearing. It kind of makes you feel in a very weird kind of way part of the process almost.
Yeah.
Sure. It's
Absolutely. I mean, that's Peter's gift, and that's very Peter. Right from the beginning, he said, win the fans, win the crowds. I mean, and it's a very anti-Hollywood thing. Hollywood's attitude is secrecy. It's don't tell anyone what's going on, keep it, locked down. Peter said, no, don't let them in. The famous story about the One Ring guys who were on the outside, and instead of arresting them, Peter invited them in, gave them a job to do, and that was him. He said, you've got to have them on side, because he's like that. He's a geek. He adores filmmaking history, and he adores talking about shots and how they do things and makeup and models. And he loves all that so much that was very sensible. And he said, then we could release the images and the information in our way and have everybody on side. And he changed Hollywood in a way by doing that.
He did,
I think that kind of approach.
Yeah,
very different.
it's very inspirational for any filmmakers and anyone who's interested in it to see that and to be invited in and to get to learn about it. And I feel like, again, it is one of those things where he was kind of like a pioneer to create something that I've seen so many people do afterwards that I hadn't seen before, like the behind the scenes series, which is just fantastic. I had a question. I wanted to ask about, the trio, Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh. Yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, this is one of the key themes for me in the book was the team that was behind Peter. Well, not behind him, with him, alongside him. The more I met them and the more I read and the more I kind of asked Peter about it, it became clear that while he was the director, it was a kind of triple-headed beast, that ran this thing, that thought it up. And the participation of both Fran Walsh, who's obviously Peter's partner, but obviously a creative partner as well, and Philippa Boyens is absolutely vital to the story. You do not have the triumph of Lord of the Rings without the presence of those two people. And in different ways, what became interesting was that it was, Peter was the visionary in terms of shooting and visually creating the film. The script, although Peter had a large amount to do with the script, is really Fran and Philippa. And Philippa was the Lord of the Rings expert. I mean, she came into it through, I don't know if you know the credits on the Two Towers, but there's a screenwriter, Stephen Sinclair, gets a credit. It's a bit of a mystery how he's a New Zealand playwright and novelist who had been involved at a very, very early stage when Fran and Peter were trying to figure things out. And they thought they'd get a bit of an outside eye on it. And he wasn't a Tolkien guy at all. But his girlfriend at the time was Philippa Boyens. And she tells a wonderful story about this call came through from Fran and Peter to Stephen saying, please come and can you help us with Lord of the Rings? And he turned to Philippa and said, you'll never guess what they're doing. And she was, what? He goes, they're adapting Lord of the Rings. And she said she got quite angry. She said, they can't do that. That's ridiculous. That's impossible. She got annoyed because she's a Tolkien purist, a fan.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And she knew in her head that it was impossible to do this. And then he showed her kind of first scripts, and all these notes would come back. She lived in Auckland at the time, would come back to Fran and Peter from Philippa, and around the edges. You can't do this. Tolkien meant this. So they said, they got her down to Wellington, and they said she was brilliant because every time she had a complaint about what they were doing, she had a solution to it. She didn't just go, that's wrong. She go, this is how you should do it. And then she realized she was already involved. And that's when they signed her up. And Stephen Sinclair kind of lost interest and left. And she then became the third musketeer. And she brought this kind of faith in Tolkien. She brought the kind of idea that these are the themes of Tolkien: World War I, the idea of death, industrialization, and all the things you guys know. She said, we've got to bear them in mind. They're not explicit, but they must be implicit in what we do. It was Philippa who pushed for the kind of deep mythos to be heard in lines, the great confrontation between the Balrog and Gandalf, Flame of Undun, and none of that stuff's explained, but it just gives it a kind of solidity and a power. She said, we just got to put it in. Don't put too much of it in and don't concentrate on it because then you'll just confuse the audience. But what you do is you kind of back up, you say, well, this is this mythology behind it. It's all Philippa, that stuff. She wrote the prologue, famously. The first thing she ever put down as an official screenwriter on Rings was the first line. There's a Treebeard line that's given to Galadriel, and it's it's stayed through all their kind of changes on the screenplay that went on. The very first line never changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it. That kind of that wonderful kind of way in, and then the Elvish was Fran's idea. And Fran said, let's just put some Elvish in right off the bat and see what happens. Because Fran was the other attitude. Fran was she used to be a punk rocker. So she had a kind of non-devotee attitude. She's a great artist and a great one for finding psychological depth. I mean, Gollum is her triumph, really, as well as a technical one and an Andy Serkis one. But she was the driving force of Gollum. She really got that to work because that's her excitement. And she brought a lot of the kind of psychological inquiry, which probably isn't there in the book so much, into the film, that you had to understand them as characters.
Yeah.
So the dynamic was fantastic. You had a purist and you had a kind of contrarian, and you had this kind of visionary filmmaker who always wanted to see it in film terms. So he would kind of also dictate that, yeah, you can go off with these tangents, but I've still got to make a film out of this. Come back to me, with scenes. Yeah. And I think that dynamic is probably the great triumph of Rings. And of course, Fran directed scenes. She did a lot of second unit. She did a lot of the Sam, Gollum, Frodo stuff. Was Fran directing it? Obviously, with Peter overseeing things. So enormously important input, I think, was had by those two guys. And Fran, she doesn't. I've interviewed her, I think, once or twice. She doesn't like the limelight at all. She doesn't want to be out there in front of it. Because I think if she'd asked for a co-directing credit, Peter would have accepted that. He would have said, "No, you are." And Philippa didn't direct scenes, but she was so important to that screenplay. And she's just very funny. Philippa's wonderful. She just talked about, the days when Viggo and Sean Bean turned up and these guys were on set. She goes, well, those are days, you've got a bit of the kind of, Viggo's around, she liked to sex it up a bit. She kind of thought it was, And I think that's also important. They sort of saw through the danger of it being too schoolboy and too 14-year-old boys. They wanted adult women saying, we got to put some stuff in this that's grown up. That shows you, you talked about believability at the beginning. I think that comes down to their attitude. They're grown, and there isn't much sex in it, obviously, but there's a kind of an undercurrent, certainly in terms of how the men are depicted, that's kind of very sexy. And I think that comes from Fran and Philippa.
Yeah.
And it's stuck. I mean, like Philip, that there hadn't been a Peter Jackson production, Middle-earth related or not, that weren't written with, certainly Fran Walsh, but also Philippa Boyens, like Philippa Boyens co-wrote King Kong. So it definitely, it stuck, it remained.
It's a great team. And they live next door to each other.
Yeah.
Philippa lives next door to Fran and Peter. Do you think they'd be so sick of each other? But no, they absolutely just live over the fence. They can just shout over the fence.
That's so nice. But that's how it is, though. You become sort of a family, like, especially if you have common interests and you're working on something like this. And also, like you said, like, it is important to have all the different aspects to make a good film adaptation of a movie that has such a substantial group of hardcore fans. And then you have the potential of, all of the other people in the world wanting to also capture them, which is the big challenge. You can't just make a film for one group of people. You have to make it so that potentially it can capture everyone. And that's the importance of having, the purists that can interpret Tolkien's words and who knows everything in detail there. And then you have the filmmaker who knows how things will look on screen and also understands the special skill of storytelling for a screen is to understand that you don't need to explain everything. You just show it. And you don't need to over-explain it. Like you said with the Flame of Undun, it's not like, it's just enough to make it magical, but not over-explaining it. So you're like, okay, well, this is too much of a historic lesson, sort of. So, and then you have the person in the middle who's like, okay, well, I like this, and let's spice this up a bit. Let's keep this interesting. Who understands what people want to see and can also relate to other groups like women. Like, I remember I was quite young. I think I was 13 when I first saw The Fellowship, and it did change my life, and it became sort of the root of who I am as a person, because I felt so much relation. Like, I felt like I belonged in Middle Earth pretty much, which is kind of a geeky thing to say, but most people will understand.
But Philippa would understand that. Philippa will know that principle. She read the books and she said, I belonged there. I didn't belong in New Zealand. I wanted to live in Middle Earth.
Yeah, me too, 100%. I was ready to have surgery on my ears and move into the forest and learn how to shoot with a bow and arrow, but I accepted just watching the movies and reading the books. But it, I remember a lot of the older girls around me were talking about, Aragorn being this rugged, handsome guy and Legolas being this perfect version of a man, and just yeah, and it was just like, yeah, it kind of had something for everyone, I feel.
Yes.
If you were old enough to watch it, you would enjoy it.
Yeah,
So they
absolutely.
did a good,
Yeah,
really
it's
good
it's a
job.
very important point though that I think it's on the preface to the screen treatment. And I keep telling people this in discussions
Yeah.
about adaptations, which is that they say, we are making this for people who never have and never will read the book, which is very important from an adaptational standpoint. I mean, David Lean said that if he adapt, and he would only adapt, he said that if he adapted a book well, anyone who's watched the movie and would try to read the book would just get bored within 200 pages. Because he would have streamlined it. So it's yeah, sure, movies are made for people who have not read the book primarily.
Yeah.
There was a strange current in what they were doing, in that when it was 2 films and initial versions of 3 films, they actually went quite a long way away from Tolkien. They sort of tried things. I mean, the famous one is Arwen at Helm's Deep, and they had her as much more of an action character. And they tried all these different things because they were pursuing a cinematic line. They were pursuing an idea of got to get it away from Tolkien and into the movie houses. And they found that they kept bending back toward Tolkien. When they got frustrated and things weren't working narratively, they sort of opened the book and said, what would Tolkien do? And they realized that actually Tolkien had already thought of the best solutions to these problems. And they found that they went all the way out and sort of started coming back in again, sort of there and back again. They came back to Tolkien, although there are big differences. The films actually are, I think, admirably faithful to the framework of Tolkien's story. I mean, you can see all the kind of main beats. I mean, they took out some characters and changed them, and obviously Tom Bombadil, all those kind of things that kind of had to go. But there was this kind of gravitational pull of the book that sort of stopped them sort of going a little bit out of hand with what they were trying.
So your first time on set was for The Fellowship, or was it for Two Towers?
No, it was Two Towers. So Fellowship, all the press was done in Cannes at the kind of presentation. So that's where I first met Peter. I interviewed him. They had this kind of big press do in this lovely French sort of castle just north of Cannes. And so I interviewed him underneath these kind of trees, a very appropriate setting, very kind of sylvan. And all these kind of catkins kept raining down on us during the interview. We were both covered in catkins at the end of it. Kind of felt right. And then there was a lovely party, this incredible party in this chateau in the evening. And they had the kind of, they shipped over all these kind of bits of set. So they had the high bar from the Prancing Ponies. You had to order drinks like this and get them out. And it was great. I mean, the party was almost like a reflection of the shoot and the whole attitude. There's no VIP lounge or anything like that. The actors were just wandering around, or they're on the dance floor, and it was so chilled. You could sort of sit down and chat to John Rhys-Davies. He was like holding court in one corner. And you could see Christopher Lee with his party. They had all these pictures in a gallery, these lovely black and whites. Christopher Lee stole his own picture. He said, well, I'm having that. And so he was walking around with his own picture in this party. No one was going to stop him. It was Christopher Lee who was going to argue. So that also spoke to me about the kind of attitude that they had. It was this kind of fantastic party. But the first time I got out there was for Two Towers, and they were doing the supplementary shooting. And obviously, it's quite an interesting experience, I think, both for me as a journalist and a writer, and also, I think, for a lot of the cast and crew as well, to come back to a film and to sort of carry on making it once you know the first part is a triumph. Once you've had this kind of jolt of Fellowship coming out and being accepted, not just accepted, becoming a hit, but getting this kind of almost universal critical praise. People were saying, my God, this is masterpiece. Then Oscar nominations come along. And suddenly, it's a great New Line thing about New Line's attitude completely changed. They got these Oscar nominations. It's like they didn't know what film they had until they put it out there. And suddenly they thought, this is important. This isn't just a blockbuster. This is art going on. Who would have thought we were doing that? My God, it's got drama and acting and all these things. So suddenly their attitude changed. A lot of money went back into the production at that point. So to go back and to join them at a point where there was a lot of confidence They were buoyed. But also, Peter, being a typical Kiwi, would say there was a lot of pressure. Now they had something to live up to. Now they had to kind of do this. And they really were, and he sort of says it, said, Fellowship's great because Fellowship's a linear story. It's kind of the most, if you want, fairy tale of them. The group comes together, they go on the mission, they break up at the end. Actually, its structure is fairly straightforward in narrative terms. They only sort of split at the very end. It's a bit of complex stuff at the beginning where Gandalf has to go off and the hobbits have to get going on their own. A little bit of sort of stuff around there. But Two Towers, and Return of the King, they're all over the map. They are all over the place. Plus, so that was a great challenge in the sense of, well, how are we going to make sense of this? And what tone does the film have? How does it change from Fellowship? And also they had this extraordinary challenge put in front of them called Gollum. And if Gollum hadn't worked, you could have had 2 and 3 being a little bit off beam and a little bit kind of laughable. I'm sure you said all the Helm's Deep and all the kind of glorious things. But there was still this kind of great risk factor in the second film, especially, is that Gollum has to become a central character. He can't be a CGI thing in the background. He's a character in this film. And Michael Desky again talks about it. So he remembered the day when Peter just sort of arrived. It must have been a production meeting of some sort. And Peter went, he's got to have close-ups. I've got to have Gollum having close-ups. And he said that was a change in special effects. As soon as he said that, that required the whole special effects industry to shift in extraordinary ways. And already they were kind of moving into motion capture and all those things were going on. And Andy was becoming this extraordinary kind of part actor, part scientist, part filmmaker. He was doing all sorts of things to make Gollum work. But Peter just comes and says that we have to have close-ups. And out of close-ups was born those extraordinary scenes. To my mind, probably the best scenes in the whole trilogy, where Gollum talks to himself. He has these kind of soliloquies, which are, they're one in each of Two Towers and Return of the King. And they were all written by Fran. They're all Fran's kind of creation on the page. And I think you look at those scenes, and then that's where it's a masterpiece. All the other things, of course, make it a masterpiece. But to have that kind of ambition, to throw a CGI character right in front of us, and to have
especially at that time as well, because we've come really far now. Like the difference between the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit series, and also the difference from the Hobbit series on to now more fantasy stuff that's being made with almost full CGI. That was also a revolutionary thing with Gollum, with close-ups, with a guy running around recording voice and facial movements and body movements in real time with it's just it's brilliant. And they did that really well in The Lord of the Rings. I personally feel like there was a little too much CGI before we were ready in The Hobbit, but I still enjoyed the films. I did.
I know the arguments about The Hobbit and did special effects become too convenient and all those things, but I saw we saw the beginnings of Gollum. In fact, I was the first person to interview Andy Serkis about it. He hadn't spoken to anyone because obviously they kept him out of the way of the first film, so he was a sort of secret. They didn't want him. He went to the premieres, but he had to go in around the back. He couldn't because he didn't want him on the red carpet. People going, well, who do you play? And he was have to start explaining Gollum. They didn't want all that stuff out there yet. So I was the first one to interview him, and we had the first time he got to sort of rationalize what was going on. But I got to see them do it. And at that point, they hadn't yet got to the stage where they could motion capture on location. They were still doing scenes and then doing the motion capture later. And this is almost like it was like a school hall, like an old school gym, and it's these kind of computers around the outside. And it was the volume.
Yeah.
And there he was in his leotard on these kind of blocks, banging a plastic fish. And you're a bit like, what exactly is going on? I was like, and of course, because it was Lord of the Rings, there was all these kind of computer guys kind of trying to explain it to us, going, well, we're taking in the data from his movements, and that was confusing. But I remember vividly from that moment, because it was taking quite a long time, and we were sort of standing around. As anyone who's been on a movie set, there's a lot of standing around that goes on.
Yeah.
While we're doing that, I was just standing by a guy with a computer monitor, and he sort of winked at me and said, have a look at this. And he sort of opens up a file on his computer, and it's the whole of the opening sequence. Gandalf plunging down Khazad-dûm, rolling, and all that, catching up with the Balrog. I don't know whether he was allowed to show it to me at all, but he didn't care. He just wanted to show it to me. It was just on his computer. And I was just like, blimey, he's like, have a look at this. And it's just, So, and I didn't know that was
Okay.
exactly how it would open, but he just said, you've got to see this sequence. And that just sort of, that kind of attitude, he just wanted to show it to you, was what they were like. It was just like, you know, we're waiting for Andy to sort of sort something out, some technical thing. So have a look at the whole of the Gandalf battle sequence with the Balrog. And you just think, and it was just this big, you know, on a computer, but it was still brilliant. It was like, whoa, okay, you know, that is something.
That's awesome. Yeah. So was it like when you got to the set, did it feel like for you, because there would have been a lot of the same people coming back again, did it feel like sort of people coming back to summer camp? Like, was it like everybody's like, oh, hey, how's it going? You know, it's so good to see you. It's been a while. You know, not a while. It wasn't even that long between shootings. But...
Yeah, I think the time when I got there, I think they'd been going for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. So they'd sort of, and they weren't all there at the same time. So the Hobbits came in and did stuff, and then Orlando Bloom and John Rhys Davis, because obviously what they were concentrating on at different times, schedule terms.
Yeah.
I mean, Vigo went away and made a film, Hidalgo. So he'd been away filming Hidalgo and could come back. And that's how bizarre the whole thing was. They would go off and make films and come back, and this whole Lord of the Rings process was carrying on. So but there was this familiarity and sort of comfort and enjoyment, I think, in what was going on. They laughed a lot. Obviously, they were very professional, very serious. And when cameras rolled, suddenly they were in character, and there it was.
Yeah, they're professional. It's their job. So
Totally.
like,
McKellen is he was effortless. He would just sort of saunter around, chat to people, and well done, where have I been? And he's done some Shakespeare or something, and talk about it, time of day. And then Peter would call, and he just walk straight back on set, turn into Gandalf in literally a second, and there he was. Yeah, he was absolutely effortless. There was they were all so different. Sean Astin, he had a bit more sort of going on in terms of preparation. And so he would have this whole kind of thing where he sort of got his character going and, you know, got his process going, and they would say, Elijah were just laughing at it. You know, this is kind of how funny it was. It's like, come on, you know, it's like, oh, no, okay, I'm ready now. He's all a bit sort of la-di-da about it, but it was just, they were very at ease with it. And I know the whole journey had been exhausting, and there'd been many difficulties and many trials, but that attitude, I think, created the attitude of the film, that kind of bonding. It was another thing in the book, or the theme of the book was the idea of community, and the fact that they were so isolated from Hollywood, the fact that, you know, it's this kind of tiny little town in the kind of bottom end of the North Island, and they would go off in these incredible locations, but they were always together. And this idea of community became a spirit in the film, that everybody knew everybody, and everybody went to everybody's houses, and everybody sort of went out to pubs together, and that, I think, was very different from anything they'd experienced elsewhere. It had a different aura to it.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that. That's pretty much exactly what it's pictured in the extended DVDs, but you never really know, because even then it's edited. So it's always good to hear someone who has experienced it tell the story, because
it was, you know, we went out in Wellington, and we ended up in a bar, and there is Bernard Hill and Andy Serkis in the bar chatting. So hi guys. I got taken to an All Blacks England game by the shoot, and Viggo Mortensen was with us too. In fact, I foolishly wore an England scarf. We were sitting right amongst all the New Zealand fans, and they were about, can you take the scarf off? You know, England won that game, but rare win for England in Wellington. So it didn't go down too well. I was wearing an England scarf, but there was Viggo with us. But it wasn't like everyone, oh, Viggo. They just kind of ignored it, because it was just part of the community.
Yeah, that's it's kind of the same in Norway, actually. If you're a celebrity here, people are like, oh, look, it's that person from that TV show, but we don't like flock them unless Justin Bieber and you have lots of teenage fans, maybe. But I think New Zealand is very much the same. Easygoing, relaxed, very good. Did you have a particular like favorite moment of the whole entire process?
Blimey, that I don't know, because I look at the two set visits I did. I mean, I think about 5 for The Hobbit, but the 2 ones I did for Lord of the Rings were incredibly special. Just my first time in New Zealand, that alone, is kind of saying life-changing. the light is different there. The world is different. You're on the other side of the world, and it's beautiful beyond belief. And then suddenly you were on this set, and it was just, you know, things you dreamed of as a kid, and that was extraordinary. And then just sort of hanging out. Yeah, there was this great sense of hanging out on set. And I just would treasure more than anything that sort of sense that the next thing was always brilliant. So we would sort of spend time with Peter shooting sequences. We'd go and see Fran shooting stuff with Gollum. We'd talk to Andy. And then they said, yeah, listen, do you want to go to the workshop? And I said, well, yeah, great. And it's just down the road. It's 5 minutes away. So you just walk down to the workshop. It's such a small little area, Miramar. And you go in and there's Richard Taylor. And of course, you know what Richard Taylor's like. He gets going and telling you endless stories, and he's got the whole kind of mythology in his head. But it's like, come and see the swords. And so you're swinging the swords around. You know, they don't worry about you dropping something. So you're picking up these incredible props. And then my favorite in terms of just a visit was the miniatures. You know, the thing that made me most geek out, if you want, this guy called Alex Funke, who came from Hollywood, and he's an extraordinary, you know, I didn't get much work anymore, but he was an extraordinary miniatures shooter. He did The Abyss, and he's got this incredible history, Battlestar Galactica. He's the loveliest guy. He laughs at everything. He's just got this, he's like a gentle giant. He finds everything hilarious. And we were just wandering around together, and he would say, oh yeah, you know, here's Minas Tirith. And there was this Minas Tirith, you know, like his giant wedding cake. And I'm like, well, when you finish shooting, what do you do with it? If you don't need, if you don't need it anymore, how much? I can take it off your hands.
I'll take it. Like, yeah.
I'll have it right in the corner of my room. I can see it, and you know, it was just lovely. And that, I suppose, is the closest I've ever been to the process.
Yeah.
As I say, and you go on a Hollywood set, you're kind of an observer, and you usually interview people in some room out the back. But here I was, literally, they were shooting things. They were remarkable. I remember in the miniature studio, what they were shooting that day was like gravel, and they were just moving it in tiny amounts. And it was Gollum's footprints. It was Gollum moving on gravel they were shooting. That's how detailed it was. And they would do it really slowly, and people just moving a bit of gravel, and then they would shoot it again. And it just was how, and of course they would then animate Gollum on top of that. That's how they were doing it. It was just like, whoa.
That's fantastic. I love stuff like that, like the process. I should probably, if I wasn't an actor, I should probably do what you're doing, because I'm just so fascinated by the whole thing.
And it's, but I think a lot of it, you know, it's brilliant. I had such a privileged life, but there can be great frustrations when you know, you go and you're confronted by the system of studios and resistance. And I think the great joy of Lord of the Rings is that we were removed from that. And it had been a unique experience for me in my career, that I got all this stuff, and you know, there was never a down moment. There was always things that things weren't working with the Gollum stuff. They would show me footage on a screen. There was never a quiet moment. You know, that evening, it was packing it all in was the problem. It's like, right, tonight we've got to go and watch Fellowship Extended Cut at Camperdown Cinema, and they'll all be there. And it's like, so we all had this kind of schedule to keep to just so we could do it all. But yeah, it was, I mean, I've been to New Zealand, I think 15 times now. I fell in love with the country as well. I don't know if you've been out yet, you guys.
It's on my bucket list. I still haven't gotten there, but it's 100% there.
It's such a cliche now. You know, oh, it's like Middle Earth, and oh, it's spiritual experience. It is. And, you know, I have to say. And
it's like a pilgrimage. It's like you have to go and experience it.
Honestly, and they took us to this country estate where they filmed Galadriel in the boat, and they filmed Deagle and Smeagol fighting there. It's just this lake in the country grounds. And they flew us there in helicopters, dropped us there, and just to see this lake, and they had all the costumes there, and just these places you were taken to, and were just extraordinary. And I didn't see Hobbiton until Hobbit, because obviously they dismantled it at that point, and they rebuilt it for the Hobbit. But I remember I got shown around by the Alexanders, the guys who owned the farm. That another famous story, and they found Hobbiton and all that stuff. And they said there's this kind of cut, the Gandalf's cut you go through, and then you see it spread out. Guys, you've got to do this. You start saving now, and you've got to do this. And it's brilliant. You go around, you don't quite see it, and then suddenly it's there. And they said people cry. It says they come around the corner. They have these people come there, and they burst into tears. because it's
It's
kind of the
there.
point where you step into it, and it's all there.
It's like coming
Doorways.
home. Like
Yeah,
for someone who
absolutely.
believes that Middle Earth is where they belong, that's like coming home. Seeing
Absolutely.
that,
Getting people
like,
back out of Hobbiton might be a bit more of a problem because you'll go home now. Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, and you can have lunch at the Green Dragons. You got to do it. You have to go there and do Mount Doom and do. I mean,
Oh,
South
wow,
Island
yeah.
alone is like one of the most beautiful parts of the world. And even if you're not seeing Lord of
Yeah.
the Rings, it's just fabulous. So
Yeah, New Zealand is beautiful with or without the Lord of the Rings, but it was the perfect setting and the perfect backdrop for making these films, I reckon.
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah. And these the kind of accumulation of factors, if you want, how did it work? New Zealand, I think, was something that Peter just naturally relied on. Yeah, he knew the country, and he could easily, I think, him and Fran at the very beginning would be able to break the script down and kind of start, casting locations in their head. We can do that. I mean, there were some brilliant location scouts who went out, and Dave Comer was a guy who I met. He's died now, sadly, but I met him and toured around, and he was a Tolkien nut. Yeah, he'd read the book. He said I'd already traveled around, and he'd been a sort of park ranger. So he was kind of a bit like Aragorn as well. He's a man of the wild.
Yeah.
And he said I'd already pinpointed places in my head that I knew were those locations. So as soon as he got the job, he was like, right, this is the Misty Mountains. This is where I see that. And so the only one he didn't know was Hobbiton, but he found Hobbiton all the same. So.
Yeah, I think they did a good job there. And it's also perfect to have someone who is a Tolkien not do the location scouting, because a lot of the time the pictures that we see in our head are quite similar. Some aren't, but a lot of it is. So because of the descriptive way that Tolkien is explaining it as well. So they did well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what how I relaxed into the film was it looked like the book in my head. Moria looked like Moria. Lothlorien looked like Lothlorien. But for you two guys, were there any parts of the book that looked different from how you imagined them, in the film? Not necessarily worse, but there are things you thought I didn't see that quite like that.
Yeah, there are things like I think when I read the book and I read Frodo, I don't imagine Elijah Wood specifically. I don't know why, right. but which isn't to say that it isn't compelling. It's just different.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's just a lot of the stuff is the same. Some things at random seemingly are just the imagination. Often even the description is a little bit different. It's suddenly like Tolkien's descriptions of both Theoden and Denethor come across as much older in the book than they do in the film. Those sorts of things, but otherwise, a lot of the stuff is the same. Though Gandalf is the same. So yeah, sure.
Yeah, I found that Minas Tirith for me, I envisioned it a little bit more middle-agey, sort of, not as like, yes, white, but not as white, and not as like, because it kind of to me reminded me a little of Isengard in the way that it's built, like the height wise, it kind of looks like a tower. And I sort of envisioned it a little bit more like an old sort of middle-aged town, as in the kind that you would see in King Arthur, only white, and then a little bit like the rings go in the city, but not upwards. I don't know why, but when I saw it, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And then I just accepted it for what it was. So there wasn't any real disappointments apart from the bit where I thought I knew that Frodo, like everybody else who hadn't read the books would think that Frodo was dead, whereas I knew it wasn't in the change from the Two Towers and to the Return of the King. That was my biggest disappointment, that they chose the cut differently, but I understand why they did it the way they did. The cliffhanger would have probably been too much to bear for a lot of people.
Yes. But a bit of a jolt at that stage of the story. You've gone all this way with them, and he's dead.
Yeah.
They also, they were trying to keep tabs, I think, with Tolkien's chronology, because he does chart these things out by days in the appendix. And when they looked at it, it was apparent that those chapters in the Two Towers happened at the same time as the Battle of Minas Tirith, so they moved it to where it made sense to intercut.
Yeah.
It sort of downplays the book plays Sam's role in that much more heightened way, doesn't it? Sam becomes the kind of ring bearer for a short. And they sort of, which I understand, because it's another thing that Tolkien sort of doesn't help you out with, is the ring's power. No one else should have the ring really apart from Frodo. But for that little bit, it has to go to Sam. The idea is that they will all be corrupted by it if they carry it. So Aragorn has to say no, Gandalf has to say no, Galadriel has to turn it down, all these incredibly powerful characters. And they're kind of thinking, well, Sam, he's resolute, but with Sam not being instantly corrupted by the ring, it was kind of a real debate about how far do you take that. And I think Tolkien took it a lot further, that Sam does a lot more putting the ring on and off, and whereas they kind of did it but got it over with quite quickly.
Which is one of those things that is a good example of how storytelling, like adapting something from a book or a game into a visual storytelling device, as television, as the movies, there are challenges there. It wouldn't have worked the same way. There would have been an uproar of people who didn't want, like, who thought Frodo was dead. If we ended it there, it would have been chaos. And then everybody who knew it and had read it would have spoiled it anyway. So it wouldn't have been, there's no point, there's no need. So where do we then end it? And how do we end it in a way that's still compelling, makes people want to see the last one who haven't read the books?
There's a lovely, and I kind of put a lot of things, often Lord of the Rings as films aren't talked about as films, if you understand me. They're talked about as great adaptations, great story, but we don't analyze them in film terms. The narrative and the choice of shots. But if you look at it, the structure is so elegant. The screenwriting is that they and Philippa Boyens talked a lot about, they had to find emotional endings certainly for Fellowship and for Two Towers that complete those stories, but suggest the story is carrying on. So they complete those films in an emotional way. And the answer was always the Hobbits. You have to end, it's with Sam really giving a speech. It's Sam they kind of return to in both those things. He gives a big speech. You get a bit of Gollum-y stuff at the end of Two Towers, which kind of gives you the idea of threat. It keeps it going. But really it's the Hobbits. And if you look at the way each film starts, they all start with sort of dreams and memories and flashbacks. It's like we don't know where the prologue comes from. It's like we know Galadriel's telling us, but when is it being told to us? And it's being told directly to the audience, basically. But she's not talking to anyone. There's no sort of point, So it could have been years before, or it could have been something that happened to her and Frodo while they're in Lothlorien. We don't know when that happened. And then the Two Towers starts with Frodo sort of having this psychic connection with Gandalf, that he dreams Gandalf's battle with the Balrog. So it starts with the Gandalf fighting the Balrog, and it cuts to Frodo waking up. And then the Return of the King starts with Gollum's dream of being Deagle, was Smeagol and Deagle fighting, and remembering how that began. And he wakes up and he's sort of gone away. So there's this lovely elegance between how they tell the stories and how they start and finish them. And it's a great lesson for people who want to do trilogies. Now, I mentioned Dune, which, however good or bad you think it is, doesn't end in the most satisfying way, because they didn't understand the thing that I think Philippa Boyens and the team understood, that it doesn't reach an emotional climax. It feels like we've only stopped. We just sort of say, right, that's enough, and we'll move off and come back again. Whereas Fellowship feels like a completed film, and Two Towers feels like a completed film within. I know we now look at them like one giant film, but actually they work very much as individual films. And that's about structure, beautiful structuring by the screenwriters.
Yeah, they did a very good job. I see that we've gone on for quite a while, so we're gonna have to wrap it up. But Ken, do you have any more questions that you want to ask?
Nothing in particular. I just was very taken with this last remark that we should look at these more as movies. Then I try to do that all the time. Like look at the mise en scène, at the way they're directed, at the way they're written as screenplays, at the way they're cut, rather than just as explorations of Tolkien. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the cinematic language of those movies very much, and that's what ultimately really draws people in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The kind of the vaulting quality that Peter Jackson kind of invented, that you could swoop off the side of buildings and fly over mountain ranges in one shot. Yeah.
Yes.
It has
I
this very
remember that.
lively camera work. Yes.
Yeah.
The whoosh, as it's called, the whooshing sensation. But
Yeah.
that's how you get this idea of a world across.
Yes.
You just literally, you fly across it, just do that rather than cut and show and cut and show. But it's that's filmmaking.
Yeah, it is. It's good filmmaking. They really did something with these films, and The Fellowship was definitely the start of a massive journey for many people, a new journey for the people who hadn't read the books, and a continuation, I guess, for the people who had. And yeah, it is important to look at not only what they did with adapting the book, but also the way they did it, and think about it both in technical terms, in filmmaking terms, and also in how respectful they were towards Tolkien's work and the fans that already existed before the books. But I think they did a really good job.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll end it there. But thank you so much, Ian, for joining us today.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, guys.
Great.
To everyone at home watching, thank you so much. We appreciate your support, and yeah, have a good one. Thanks for watching.